Rise, my apprentice.
Leia Organa knelt on the cold Durasteel floor of the Death Star, her body trembling, not from fear but from the sheer weight of what she had just witnessed. Alderaan was gone, her home, her people, her family, gone in an instant. The cold, merciless voice of Grand Moff Tarkin still echoed in her mind. She had screamed, pleaded. But the super laser had fired anyway, and the planet that had been her whole world, her childhood, her memories, her friends, her parents, had been reduced to dust. Her fingers dug into the steel floor, her nails scraping against it as she clenched her fists. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, her chest tight with pain so deep she thought it might rip her apart.
So much pain.
The voice was not her own. It came from the towering shadow standing over her. Darth Vader. His presence was suffocating, the air around him thick with darkness. Leia barely had the strength to look up, but when she did, her eyes burned with fury.
You monster!
Her voice was raw, filled with venom. Vader said nothing at first. He only stood there, his mechanical breathing the only sound in the silent chamber. Then, after a long moment, he spoke.
I know your key.
Leia let out a sharp, bitter laugh, though it was more of a choked sob.
You know nothing of my pain.
She glared at him, her brown eyes burning with hatred.
You destroyed my home, my family, everything I loved. There is nothing left.
Vader tilted his helmet slightly, as if considering her words.
Then why do you still fight?
Leia froze.
Why do you resist?
His voice was calm, almost intrigued.
You have lost everything, yet I can feel it. You burn with fury, with grief. That fire inside you, princess. It is not weakness, it is power.
Leia shook her head, tears stinging her eyes.
I hate you!
Vader took a slow step forward.
Very good.
Leia sat alone in the dark confines of her cell, knees drawn to her chest. Her hands clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. She had stopped crying. There were no more tears left. Only anger. Not just at the Empire. Not just at Tarkin. At him. Darth Vader. His presence haunted her thoughts. His voice a ghost in her mind.
Hate is not your enemy. It is your ally.
She gritted her teeth. She refused to listen to the words of a monster. And yet, the more she thought of him, the more she let his image linger in her mind, the angrier she became. Vader had taken everything from her. Her parents, her people, her home. He had stood there, cold and unfeeling, while Alderaan was wiped from existence. He had spoken to her as if he understood her pain, as if he knew what it felt like to have something precious ripped away. And worst of all, he had left her alive. Had it been mercy, a calculated move, or was it something else? She hated that she didn't know. Her hands trembled as she thought about what she would do if given the chance. She would kill him, strike him down with her own hands, make him suffer as she had suffered. The thought sent a rush through her, a sharp, burning satisfaction. Then, just as quickly, it soured in her stomach. She shut her eyes, breathing heavily. This wasn't her. This wasn't who she was raised to be. She had spent her entire life believing in diplomacy, in peaceful resolutions, in justice over vengeance. She had dreamed of a galaxy free from war, not one where violence only bred more violence. Her father had taught her that peace was built, not taken, that freedom was won through unity, not wrath. And yet, here she was, drenched in rage, craving destruction. Had the Empire not just done the same to her? The thought made her sick. She buried her head in her arms, shaking. The fire inside her wouldn't go out. The pain, the grief, the anger, it refused to fade. And the more she thought about it, the more Vader's words came back to her. She wouldn't become like him, but if she wanted justice, if she wanted to win, she couldn't pretend that this fire didn't exist inside her. She couldn't ignore it. She just had to make sure it didn't consume her. Darth Vader stood in silence, watching as a medical droid analyzed the vial of blood before him. He already knew what the results would show. He had felt it, raw, and unrestrained. The moment Alderaan was destroyed, the Force had screamed through Leia Organa. The power radiating from her had been undeniable, a wound in the Force itself. It had been strong, too strong, and Vader had known in that instant that she was no ordinary prisoner. The results confirmed his suspicions. Her midichlorian count was off the charts. It rivaled only one other being in recorded history, Anakin Skywalker. For a moment, Vader simply stared at the screen, the sound of his breathing filling the sterile silence of the lab. The implications were vast, but it only raised more questions. How had such a power remained hidden for so long? How had the Jedi, with all their paranoia and caution, overlooked a Force-sensitive being of this magnitude? And more importantly, who was Leia Organa? Vader turned sharply, his cape flowing behind him as he strode out of the lab.
Find everything on her,
he commanded to his officers. The officers scrambled to obey, but Vader's mind was already racing ahead. Leia Organa possessed unimaginable potential. She had no training, no understanding of the power within her, but it was there, raw, untapped. If left unchecked, it could become a threat, but if he guided it, if he shaped her power, perhaps she could become something far greater. A true apprentice. Vader's steps slowed as he considered the path before him. The Emperor had long sought a replacement for Vader, always searching for younger, more powerful beings to mold in the Sith's image. If Palpatine discovered the truth about Leia, he would seize her for himself. He would break her, twist her, make her his. Vader clenched his fist. Leia Organa was his to shape, his to mold, and whether she knew it yet or not, she belonged to him. Darth Vader stood in the cold, dimly lit chamber, his imposing presence casting a suffocating shadow over the lone figure in the center of the room. Leia Organa knelt on the steel floor, her wrists bound behind her back, her head hanging low. She had long since stopped resisting the restraints. The exhaustion in her body was real, but the defiance in her spirit had not broken, not yet. Vader had begun with words. He had taken her back to that moment, the instant Alderaan was wiped from existence. Over and over, he forced her to relive it, describing the destruction in painful detail. He made her see it again. The explosion, the screams of her people, the way the shockwave had rippled through the Force, so strong it had nearly shattered the minds of those sensitive enough to feel it.
You know it, don't you?
His voice had been cold, patient.
You felt it. The Force surged through you in that moment. You were more powerful in that instant than you have ever been in your life.
Leia had refused to acknowledge it. She had clenched her jaw, shaking, but she had not spoken. She had not let him win. Vader had not needed her words. He felt the conflict inside her, the war of emotions raging beneath the surface.
You cannot run from what you are,
he had told her.
The Force is in your blood, whether you choose to listen to it or not.
But words were not enough. Leia had resisted them, just as she had resisted the truth. And so, Vader had moved on to something far less forgiving. Pain. White-hot, searing, all-consuming pain. Leia gasped as the electricity coursed through her body, her back arching against the restraints as the agonizing current surged through her nerves. The moment it stopped, she collapsed onto the cold steel floor, her breathing ragged, her muscles twitching.
Enough.
Vader's voice cut through the air like a blade. The stormtroopers holding the controls obeyed instantly, their hands hovering over the torture devices, waiting. Vader stepped forward, his black cape billowing slightly with each measured step. He loomed over Leia, his mask unreadable, his presence suffocating.
This is not suffering,
he said.
This is weakness.
Leia gritted her teeth, forcing herself to lift her head, glaring up at him with burning defiance. Vader tilted his head slightly.
You do not know what pain truly is, but you will.
He gestured with one hand. Leia barely had time to react before an invisible force gripped her throat, yanking her into the air. She clawed at her neck, gasping for breath as Vader lifted her effortlessly with the Force.
You are weak because you fight against what is inside you.
She struggled, her vision blurring, her lungs screaming for air.
You hate me. You hate what I have done. You hate that you are powerless to stop it.
Flashes of Alderaan burned in her mind. The explosion, the screams, the emptiness.
Do not suppress it. Use it.
Leia clenched her fists, her heart pounding. The edges of her vision darkened.
Feel your anger. Feel your pain. Let it give you strength.
The rage inside her swelled, threatening to consume her. Her hands trembled as she reached out, not for him, but for anything. And then, the room shook. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Vader felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the tremor that rippled through the Force. Leia gasped as she was suddenly released, collapsing onto the floor in a coughing heap. She clutched her throat, sucking in deep, ragged breaths, her mind spinning. Vader stared down at her in silence. It was not enough. She had touched the Force, but she had not embraced it. Not yet.
We are far from finished, but you are beginning to understand.
Leia sat on the cold steel, her body broken, her mind exhausted, but her spirit was still intact. And as Vader strode from the chamber, she realized something terrifying. A part of her had almost listened. Each day, Leia grew stronger. Her movements became sharper, her reflexes faster. The blade in her hand no longer felt foreign. It was an extension of herself, of her rage, of her unrelenting will to survive. But despite her progress, she could not overpower him. Darth Vader did not hold back. Their sparring sessions were brutal, more akin to duels than training. Each strike she landed was answered with a crushing counter. Each lesson learned was paid for in pain, and when she failed, she suffered. She had lost limbs in her training, her body reforged with cybernetics, as Vader had ensured she would not die, only grow stronger. Her pain, her suffering, only deepened her connection to the Force. The fire within her had transformed into something unstoppable, but still, it was not enough. Not yet. Vader knew it was only a matter of time before she would rise to meet him as an equal. But before that moment arrived, he would break her completely. Outside of their training, Vader's focus remained fixated on Leia's origins. The power within her was too great, too unnatural to have gone unnoticed for so long. The more he investigated, the more the inconsistencies in her past stood out. Bail Organa's records on her adoption were fabricated. The documentation surrounding her arrival into the royal family was carefully constructed as if hiding something or someone. And yet, there was no mention of her true parentage, no trail to follow, only a void. But Vader had learned long ago that the Force would always provide answers to those strong enough to listen. In the depths of his private chamber, Vader knelt in meditation. The Force surrounded him, vast and infinite, its whispers echoing through his mind. He reached into its depths, peeling back the layers of deception, of time, of buried memories. And then he heard it. Her voice, not Leia's, Padme's. "Anakin, I'm pregnant." The memory slammed into him like a tidal wave. For a moment, he was no longer Darth Vader. He was Anakin Skywalker, holding Padme in his arms, feeling her warmth, hearing the joy in her voice as she shared the news that had once made him the happiest man in the galaxy. A child. Their child. But that child had died. Padme had died. Vader's breathing became uneven, the agony cutting deeper than any blade. How was this possible? How could Leia exist? His hands clenched into fists, his body trembling as the truth unraveled before him. Her voice, he had dismissed it before, but now he heard it clearly. The strength, the fire, the defiance. It had all been Padme's. She had always spoken with the same unwavering conviction, the same belief in justice, the same refusal to break, and her power, her impossible, unprecedented power. There was only one other who had ever wielded such strength. Himself. Vader's mind raced as he reached for the last piece of confirmation, a blood test. The results came quickly, but the moment he saw them, the air left his lungs. The truth was undeniable. Leia Organa was not just his apprentice, she was his daughter. The realization struck him with a force greater than any battle, any pain he had endured. For years, he had believed that he had lost everything, that Padme had died with their unborn child, that his quest for power had left him with nothing but darkness. But now he had her, his daughter, his legacy. Vader slowly rose from his meditation, the weight of this truth settling deep within his soul. Everything he had done, all the pain, all the suffering, had led to this moment. He had been training an apprentice, but now he would forge an heir. Together they would rule. Together they would reshape the galaxy. And nothing, not the Emperor, not the rebellion, nothing would stand in their way.